do. I just want to see. There it goes. Just making sure that YouTube there's a green line. Get ready. Adriana, she's away. She's watching her grandchildren up in New Jersey. She'll be back on Monday.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
She'll be back on Monday?
On Monday, yeah.
Oh.
She has to check in with everybody.
Just,
emailing. I didn't know she was
there it goes. Okay, good. So it's on YouTube, on the live stream. So good evening, everybody. And to those who are watching and those here in the room, before we get started, I want to give a little background as to why I chose this topic, because it's a provocative topic, imagining God with disabilities. Couple of reasons behind it. One is that starting tomorrow, February 1st, the month of February is Jewish Disabilities Awareness and Inclusion Month. And so that's something near and dear to my heart. I've been involved in Jewish special needs and disability inclusion for a number of years. I've had the privilege of serving on the Inclusion Committee of the Rabbinical Assembly, which is the organization of conservative rabbis. And I represent the Rabbinical Assembly on committees that happen to be based here in Washington. So this morning, for example, I was at the quarterly meeting of the Jewish Disabilities Network, which is national organizations with representatives talking about legislative issues that affect the people with disabilities community. And it's mainly Jewish organizations, obviously, Jewish Disabilities Network. And next week, there is the annual Jewish Disability Advocacy Day that is happening on Capitol Hill. Over 200 people have registered for that, so it's the largest crowd that they have for that Advocacy Day to hear from legislators themselves, representatives and senators, and then get to lobby people in Washington. So that's one reason to have this class about disability issues. Secondly, a lot of people in the congregation know about my connection to disability through a personal connection, and this is common for people who are involved in social justice issues. Usually the people who are involved are people who are most connected to that particular issue. So people who are involved in gun control, for example, are people who have been affected by that, family member or somebody else shot. And breast cancer, people who do the Susan Komen walk for the cure, etc. So, so Parkinson's, etc., etc. So, with disabilities, my only sibling, my older brother, has an intellectual disability. My wife works for the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School as the director of educational support services, so being in charge of 300 students who need some kind of accommodation, and my wife is in charge of that department. My oldest daughter has a master's in special ed and is a high school special ed teacher. My father, who's a rabbi, wrote a guide for rabbis way back when, for rabbis of the conservative movement, about making people aware, the average rabbi aware of some disability issues. So I kind of was born into this, and it is near and dear to my heart. And then finally, the immediate connection for this class is based on a class that I took at a conference 3 weeks ago, a conference that I go to every year. It's called the Rabbinic Training Institute that the Rabbinical Assembly, the Jewish Theological Seminary runs at the Pearlstone Retreat Center, which is just outside of Baltimore. So about 60 rabbis come together. We affectionately call it Rabbi Camp because we are dressed down. It's a camp-like atmosphere, and it's 2 text-based classes in the morning, a professional skills class in the afternoon, and more introspective, reflective kind of session in the evening. So it's really, really great. One of the veterans of this, probably one of the people who have attended it for the most, and it's really great. So one class that was by a Bible professor. Her name is Dr. Ora Horn-Prauser. And her topic was in God's image, or something like that. God, imagining God with a disability. And so what I want to do is not present exactly what she did over those 4 classes, but I wanted to, in 3 classes, 3 sessions, to talk about this issue. But we can't just jump into it, because the topic itself is a provocative topic, and I want to step back and understand first what it is, what it means when we say that God exists, and what that means from a Jewish perspective, to then say that we have the chutzpah, we have the audacity and the right to claim that we can imagine God in a variety of ways. So I want to begin I have a Chumash here, but I don't think we need the Chumash today. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. The very first verse of the Jewish Bible, the very first verse of the Christian Bible is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So what does that verse mean? I'm opening this up. If people online, you see right next to watching me on the right-hand side that says live chat, and you have a flashing cursor that says say something. If you have a question, you can type in a question and I'll see it there. So the first verse of the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. What does that verse mean? What does that verse imply? What are we supposed to understand from that verse?
There is a God.
That there is a God. The verse takes for granted that we understand that there is a God. So, which is really remarkable, because you would think that the Bible needs to prove for us that God exists. That perhaps the first chapter would be a discussion about how we came to understand that there is an eternal, infinite God that exists outside of the earth and outside of our own minds. In other words, we're born, we die. God doesn't die. God exists without us. And so I'm already reading all of that into chapter 1, verse 1 of Genesis, which does not say that. Genesis already implies that God exists. And then it goes on to describe what God does. God created the heaven and earth and describes in 6 days how God did that. And then on the 7th day, God rested. Okay, so that's number one, a major implication, a major assumption, a given that we already know that God exists. Then there are 2 other verses in the Torah that try to help us understand what this God is. Okay, so just leading up to the verse that I want to get to, we have figures in the book of Genesis who are in dialogue with God, but though that dialogue also implies that they know that God exists. It doesn't describe to us how they came to recognize that God exists. The story begins with them already talking to God. God creates for Adam Eve, and then tells them both not to eat of the fruit of a particular tree. They eat of the tree, and they hide, and they hear God walking through the garden. Okay, so they're already They already know God exists. They already hear God. They already are talking to God. Noah, God talks to Noah and says, build an ark because I'm going to destroy the earth. Noah doesn't say, who are you? We'd have to, and I don't know if it's PC to mention this, Bill Cosby, his routine, famous routine about that comedy routine, Noah going, what? Who are you? What is this? I'm not doing it justice. And again, not sure I would even recommend going and listening to that tape anymore because of who he is. But that, in the day, that was a very funny routine because it gets to the idea of Noah saying, wait, I'm 600 years old. That's at the time that God spoke to him, or 500 years old. Either one, he's lived a long time before he's even encountered God and takes it for granted that God's talking to him and builds the ark. If any of you said you heard God speak to you and that you were commanded to build an ark and you came to tell me about that, I think I would refer you to a psychologist to talk to the psychologist about that because it's not a normal thing.
No, but
I'm not saying it's not normal to have an encounter with God. But if you think that God is then telling you to do something highly unusual that's going to take a lot of money and going to take a lot of time, not sure that anybody would be in their right mind having a conversation, imagining they had a conversation with God about that. Okay? So that's just what I'm saying. And but the Torah doesn't have any problem with that. Abraham. First, we know that Abraham is born. We see that at the end of chapter 11 in the genealogy from Noah to Abraham. Abraham's born to Terach. They all move from Ur Kasdim, wherever that is, to Haran. Okay? Then, chapter 12 of Genesis, God speaks to Abraham, Abram, he doesn't change his name yet, and Sarai to get up and leave. Haran and go to the land I will show you. Again, who is Abraham that God's choosing to speak to Abraham? And Abraham is not questioning this. He gets up and leaves.
if you hear a voice, you have a spirit.
If you hear a voice and have it, all I'm saying is, Julian, that the Torah doesn't describe to us, doesn't think it's necessary to explain from the person's perspective how they came to understand that first, God exists, and secondly, God can talk to them. It just assumes that happens. Now, we get the Midrash, the rabbinic commentary, to explain who's Abraham, that at 75 years old, God chose him. And the Midrash explains how Abraham comes to find God through scientific deduction. In other words, the rabbis, the famous story that people think is in the Torah, but it's not in the Torah, that Terach owned an idol shop. And people come to buy idols from Terach because either he makes them or he hires good sculptors to fashion very nice, different size idols. So Terach one day says, Abram, watch the store for me. I got an errand to do. And Abram decides to smash all the idols and put this smashing implement, sledgehammer, whatever it is, into the hand of the largest idol. And Terach comes back and says, what happened here? And Abram says, obviously the largest idol smashed all the other idols. And Terach says, like your face, Julian, said, what? We know the idols can't do that. And Abram says, so what's the point? What are we worshiping idols for if an idol can't do that? There has to be some higher power. And then there are other midrashim about Abraham finding this higher power as well. So, again, it's the midrash that fills in the details that we might be questioning. Who is God? How did these people come to find God? Okay, so we have this with, with Rebecca Rebecca is pregnant with twins and goes to pray to God to ease her pain of having these twins fighting within her. How did she get that idea? Torah doesn't say. Jacob has a dream and of the ladder with angels going up and down. Builds an altar and makes a sacrifice afterwards. How did he get that idea? Okay, you could say he got it from his dad and his grandfather, but okay, where did they get it from? It's not until Moses at the burning bush that God actually defines who God is to Moses. And that's only after a little bit of dialogue. Moses said, okay, you want me to go down to the people back in Egypt. Okay, so Moses gives a lot of arguments about that. What am I going to tell the people when they ask who sent you? Brilliant question. That's the question for chapter 1 of Genesis, not chapter 3 of Exodus. Who is God? That's what Moses is saying. Who are you? I hear the voice. I see this burning bush. That's pretty cool. I've never seen that before. Okay, I got to take this seriously because it's happening for me. But wait, the people are going to say, who is this God? Meaning, you're crazy, Moses. We don't see this burning bush. Who are you to say you saw a burning bush and now you're going to be leader of the people? So what does God say? To define God's self, Eheyeh asher eheyeh. I will be that which I will be. Or I am that I am. We had discussion about this a few weeks ago in Shul. We have a discussion about it every year when we get to that point, what that phrase means. And scholars and commentators over the centuries have different ideas about what that means. But literally it means, I will be that which I will be. What does that mean? How would you define, I will be that which I will be? What idea do we have of God from that phrase? What does it mean? Do you have a clear definition of what God is from I will be that which I will be? Who gets to explain that definition then?
You just have to accept it. It's not,
Yeah, you have to accept it, but what does it mean? Whose responsibility is it to define God? Is it God defining God, or is it people defining God based on I will be that which I will be? People, right? So in other words, God isn't saying, this is who I am. He doesn't say, Ani, I. He could have said to Moses, I sent you. He could have said, God sent you. He said, I will be that which I will be, sent you. Which means, to me, people define who God is. So that, Julian, your I will be that which I will be, your definition, your picture of God, will be different from Marie's, different from Barbara's, etc., etc. Everybody will have a different idea or picture of what God is. And our picture of God today will be different than it was yesterday, meaning also 20 years ago, and tomorrow, meaning also 20 years from now. Every day, depending on what happens in our lives, our picture of God will be different, and that fits with the phrase, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, I will be that which I will be. So, this is point number one that I wanted to say about this before getting into imagining God with a disability. That the Torah does not provide a definition of God, a clear definition for God for us. The Torah provides stories. And it is based on people already knowing or experiencing God. And so we're coming into their spiritual life in the middle already. The Torah does not provide us with the beginning of the spiritual life. It doesn't explain the search for God in their lives. It doesn't explain the finding of God in their lives. It already connects us to a dialogue that is happening already. Point number one. And point number two is it is up to us to define who God is. Now, there is a parameter for this. In other words, if we like to picture God as 3 or 5 or many, or the God of rain or the God of chairs or the God of sun, we can't do that. How do we know we can't do that? From Deuteronomy chapter 4, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So when it's I am or I will be that which I will be, it's within the parameter of one God. Okay, so from those 3 statements, the Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, which already has us understand and know that God already exists, and from Eheyah, Shaare, and Shema Yisrael, we get some general guidelines of what God is. But it leaves it up to us, to, within the guideline of there is one God, to be free to imagine different ways of characterizing God. So now let's go to step number 2, which is, how do we picture God? If I were to ask you, define the Jewish God, what characteristics would you include in a definition of God?
Be a man and have a beard.
Okay, so one classic definition, one classic picture is a man with a beard. How old is this man? An old man. And how long is the beard?
It's pretty long.
Pretty long and flowing, right? And wearing, what's he wearing?
A kittle.
Okay, wearing a kittle or some kind of robe, right? A white robe. Carrying anything? Sitting anywhere?
No.
No? Just, okay. So I have the same picture, but on a throne. Okay, so the same picture, old man, long flowing beard, white robe, on a throne. Okay, so why? Why do we have this picture?
Because I used to see it in books.
Okay, so there are children's books that have depictions of God in that way. Okay, absolutely. So yes, so that's a problem because, well, it's not a problem, but it responds to, it's not so easy to say God is abstract and to try to have children understand that we need to believe in an abstract God. That's hard to do. There are ways to get preschoolers to understand this concept, but I'm not a preschool educator and I don't know how to do that. Okay, so you first say, who sets the rules in your house? To a 3-year-old, okay, mommy and daddy set the rules. Okay, so then that's one perception of that. So already I've added a definition here that God sets the rules. Okay, or God is a man sitting on a throne or not sitting, long flowing beard, white robe. Okay, but if we were to, besides a picture, what characteristics would define a Jewish God? Not the picture of God as an old man, but what are the characteristics that define God? Okay, so God is a forgiving God. Okay, so God, no matter what we do, God forgives. Okay, what else is God?
Omnipresent.
God is everywhere. Okay, so no matter where we are in the world, God is there. We can't hide from God. God is everywhere. Okay, God is forgiving, omnipresent. What else?
Demanding.
God is demanding. In what way? What does God demand of us?
He set rules that you're supposed to live by.
God sets rules that we live by. And I've changed the he to God because that's another thing. We usually apply he to God. And I just want to point out that a woman said that God is a he. Now, that when I was in rabbinical school, And that was the first year that women were allowed into rabbinical school. Women in my class gave a hard time to the Jewish thought professor who kept on referring to God as he. So at least add she to the sentence. And then it gets cumbersome to always refer to God as he, she. And it's cumbersome also to refer to God as God. Always saying God in the sentence when normally the pronoun would take the place of the noun. And so you need the he or the she or the it to replace God in the sentence. So then it becomes awkward to say God all the time. So just saying that that's a problem too. That's a challenge too. So already by applying gender to God, we're already adding something to the definition. So God is demanding, Barbara, and say that again. What's God demanding?
God has set rules.
Ah, right. So God has set rules. So Jewish rules. So we're talking about the Jewish God, Jewish rules. The system of commandments that we have, this week's portion, the 10 Commandments. Okay. So God sets the rules. God is forgiving. God is, sometimes we have gender associated with God. God is everywhere. What else? What else is God?
Just.
God is just. So we think, so we have a system of justice on earth. So we imagine God is the ultimate judge and the true judge and the best judge. Okay, so God is not just a judge, but is completely just. When we're looking for righteousness, God is the ultimate source of righteousness. Okay, what else?
God can also be angry.
Okay.
And will punish you on earth.
Okay, so God is a punishing or an angry or vengeful God. So we have these emotions that are applied to God also. What else?
Just even going through this door, he's sovereign, or God's sovereign in time and space, but he's outside of time and space. And and actually, as even prayed in the mourner's cottage and other similar prayers, he's beyond physical definition, but he's almost his attributes to be extolled, to be praised, to be acclaimed, and sort of they're almost requirements of us that actually define God, because God becomes very sort of a figure of the mind and sort of an amorphous figure beyond time and space in not defining it, but just repeating attributes or duties that we have.
So Maria is setting up this conundrum that God is beyond all of this, beyond our perceptions of time and space and how we are confined to the universe. God is beyond that, but at the same time, we apply all these attributes to God. So in other words, as I've said in other contexts, I do not have a physicist's or a theoretical mathematician's mind that can go there to understand exactly the concept that the universe is always expanding, or that the universe is contained in some. So I can't wrap my head around that very theoretical idea. So imagine then God beyond all of that, and we're trying to connect to God in some way. So the idea behind here is that it is a Jewish concept, and it's not just a Jewish idea, but all religions picture God and depict God in some way and apply certain attributes and human characteristics to God, because that's just the best that we can do. Perhaps other religions understand God as an abstract, infinite entity, or, as I even talked about this past Rosh Hashanah, that it's this force that works within us and within the universe. So not out there, but within everything. This force for good and justice in the world. However we see it, it's this other, it's outside of us, different from us, and because it is infinite, eternal, There's no way that we can connect to that because we as human beings are not infinite and eternal, and therefore we're limited by our own ability to be able to define God. But the Torah takes for granted that we're allowed to do that. That in order to connect to this one God, that is, I will be that which I will be, the Torah provides us lots of different ways of appreciating this one God. And so I just want to highlight a couple of stories for us that help depict who God is and how these depictions are part and parcel of our Jewish tradition. So what we read last week from the Torah, the portion Bishalach, the people just left Egypt, crossed the sea, and sang this song. And this is the song that the people sang that depicts, that is praise to God. And let's hear the images that we have of God from this song. This is chapter 15 of Exodus. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. They said, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and might. He has become my deliverance. This is my God, and I will enshrine him. The God of my father, and I will exalt him. The Lord, the warrior. Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea, and the pick of his officers are drowned in the sea of reeds. The deeps covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the foe. The one image of God here is all powerful, but the word is warrior. God is warrior. Okay, he hurled Pharaoh and the into the sea. God with his right arm, his right hand, glorious in power, right hand shatters the foe. Okay, and it goes on and on like that. So image number one, which we include in the morning service every single day of the year, whether it's a weekday or a holiday, we say this chapter 15. It's included as a way of understanding who God is. Okay, so God as creator. Then, based a little bit on what Barbara said, God demands of us rules. This week's portion is the portion Yitro, in which the people are at Mount Sinai. And here, God spoke all these words, saying, chapter 20 of Exodus, I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above or on the earth below. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I am the Lord your God. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day. You shall not murder. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder, or you shall not commit adultery, etc., etc. So here God is rulemaker or lawgiver. Okay, completely different from chapter 15. God is the warrior. God is a warrior in chapter 15. God here is a lawgiver. Okay, and God in chapter 1 of Genesis is creator. So wait a second. Genesis chapter 1, God is a creator. Genesis chapter 15, God is a warrior. Exodus chapter 15, God is a warrior. Exodus chapter 20, God is a lawgiver. Just three of many examples that we can come up with that describe God. Okay, so what yes.
So where it says in there, God is a warrior.
It said, yes, it says it right there.
But I'm just thinking, like, God is also the Savior.
God redeems the people out of Egypt. Yes, absolutely. Yes. So Exodus chapter 6 has that, because that's the reason why we have 4 cups of wine. Because God says to Moses at the beginning of the portion Va'era, he says, beginning with verse 6, say therefore to the Israelite people, I am the Lord. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements, and I will take you to be my people. Right, so God's Redeemer, Savior, Creator, Warrior.
So maybe, you don't, I mean, I know it's written warrior, but if we just, the only reason he did it was to save us.
Okay, what's the problem with God as a warrior?
Well, warriors of...
Adonai, well, even more than this, in the Hebrew, warrior at least implies you're fighting on our behalf. And you're fighting for a just cause, right? So that's that implication.
Because Pharaoh was also a warrior.
Pharaoh was also a warrior, but for bad reasons, right? He enslaved us. So he's on the other side of the history book.
Right.
The winners write the history book, right? And whoever loses is the bad guy. So in Egyptian history, Pharaoh's the good guy, and the Israelites are the bad guy. So they have the story written a little bit differently. Or it's so much so that we're written out of Egyptian history. Right? There's no proof that from contemporary sources at the time that the Israelites even existed. But the Hebrew says, Adonai ish milchama. God, so literally, God is a man of war. So more than warrior, God is a man of war. So now a lot of people... Our prayer book and the prior edition of the prayer book has a note in the English right before this section of the morning service that says some congregations omit this. So, which is interesting because did they omit this? And then the prayer book says some congregations omit this? Or did the editors try to convince congregations to omit this? And to say it's okay to omit this because we're saying some congregations omit this. In other words, this is a discussion for another place and time, but the idea that God is warrior, God is a man of war, might be too violent a perspective and perpetuates violence in the name of religion, and that may not be a picture that we want to convey and continue to teach to our children. So there is legitimate reason to omit sections of the prayer book that might refer to God and violence in the same sentence. Barbara.
But we as people, we're not in one dimension. We are something, and depending on what the situation is, we can be very loving and forgiving, but then in another situation, you're going to fight for what you believe in, so you're a warrior. Now, if we could be that way, cannot God be that way as well?
Right, so Barbara, that's a very important question, which leads to the crux of this class. Okay? So, yes, we want to be loving, and there are times we should be loving. We are just, we are righteous, but there are times that we need to fight. But the question, and then if we are that way, how much more so do we picture God that way? So I want to hold that thought for just a second, because get to Marie's question, then I want to get back to that. Go ahead, Marie.
Yeah, so I think the idea of a warrior, if you look at it as a metaphor, it really strengthens your faith because he's going to do the heavy lifting and the hard work. And he's always, especially if you look at it as a force against evil, being maybe an absence of God, and he will prevail. And the other thing is that he has to because he's sovereign. So just the logic of God being God, he has to ultimately do that. He'll do the heavy lifting, so the metaphor of a warrior.
Right, so yes, so there is a metaphor. God's going to do the heavy lifting, but then that also gets the other question, or a similar question to what Barbara is pointing out.
Yeah.
The question is, we take for granted that God exists. If God exists, is God independent of and exists outside of definitions, so no matter what we do, that God exists? Or does God exist because we say God exists? Okay, so in other words, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Do we know that God exists? How do we know that God exists? There's no proof that God exists. God hasn't talked to all 7 billion people in the world to say, I exist, right? Because there are a lot of atheists in the world. And there are a lot of agnostics in the world who would say, okay, maybe, maybe not. Okay. A lot of people don't know that God exists or claim that God does not exist. And we, as believers, cannot prove that God exists. We see a value to God's existence that enhances the world and how we think the world should be conducted. That is, how human beings should relate to one another. That with God, that enhances our relationship, but we can't prove that God exists. So this is another question about how we are defining God. Because really the question is, who are we to put these pictures and definitions to God? God is God. Who are we to say God's a warrior? Right? Because if we, let's say, we're like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, they preached nonviolence, fighting for a cause. How can we claim violence for a cause? Isn't that heresy in God's name? Some might argue. I'm just saying, I'm not saying that there's one right answer here. I'm just saying that this is a problem when we are making the definition of God. Or not a problem, but a challenge. But we have the right to do this because the Torah does it. The Torah gives us in chapter 15, God is warrior. Chapter 20, God is lawgiver. Chapter 1 of Genesis, God is creator. 3 very different depictions of God that stand independent of each other, but together enhance this sense that God is all and everything that we can imagine. No matter what kind of picture we have of God, God is that and more. So that leads us to what I want to start talking about next time, which is if God is lawgiver, if God is creator, if God is warrior, and God is many other things, God is forgiving, and we want to put very powerful, compassionate, forgiving, loving words to God as well. We find that in the book of Psalms, and we find that throughout the prayer book. We attach all these definitions to God. Then I want to get to next time talking about we're created in God's image and what disability has to do with that. So I think this is a good place to stop right here because the next part, it's logical to do the next thing, talking about the image of God as disabled, talking about that next time. So now we have this background of we have as long as God is one, then we can picture God in any way because the Torah is picturing God in all of these ways. And that it is a way of us understanding the infinite ways and infinite nature of God, God's self. And that will lead us then to this other way that we might not have thought of before to picture God as disabled. So, thoughts or comments?
How
Yes.
many people in the Exodus would have questioned the existence of God?
So you would think, so Julian's asking, how many people in the Exodus would question God's existence? Well, pretty much everybody, because right after they sing the Song of the Sea, they're complaining about water. And they cry to Moses, what'd you do? Take us out of Egypt to die of thirst?
It just
They just saw 10 plagues. They just did Passover. They just heard the cries of the Egyptians as their firstborn in every household died. They got to the sea and they saw the water part, which they've never seen before either. And they walked through. Then the waters collapsed on top of the Egyptians. They're saved. Next thing, they complain of thirst. So, do they believe in God? I don't know.
They were asking about the water. And yes, they were complaining, but that doesn't mean they didn't believe in God.
I'm not sure. It doesn't say. It doesn't say whether they believe in God or they don't believe in God. It certainly says they complain, and for the rabbis, that means they don't have faith. The Torah doesn't necessarily say they don't have faith, but the rabbis say they don't have faith.
I believe in God, but I'm thirsty now.
So, God, I'm thirsty.
Yeah,
they don't say that. Moses, we're thirsty. They haven't caught on yet. They see Moses as the guy who's making all this happen. So Moses, do something about it. But that's possibly where Moses failed, that they see Moses as the guy who's saving them instead of God being the one saving them. Yeah.
All humans can do is to give God attributes that they can recognize. And
Yes.
the only attributes they can recognize are things that are human.
Right.
So
it's recognizing attributes that are human attributes. And what I want to get to is even applying attributes that we might not necessarily apply to God as belonging to God too.
yeah, because that's all we know.
Okay, but again, the question is, because it's all we know, does that mean that that's all God is? What I'm saying is God is lots of other things too that we can't even know yet. And as our scientific knowledge advances, there's lots of other things that we start knowing that only, if we believe in God, only enhance our belief in God by saying, wow, look at this amazing universe. None other than God could have created such a remarkable world. Barbara. And then,
But I think that people want God to protect.
that's another attribute.
And God is not always protecting you.
But what God says to Abraham, I will bless those that will bless you, and I will shield you. Magain Avraham. I will be the shield or protector of Abraham. So yes, there is a protector aspect of God too.
And when you went out of Egypt and you were thirsty, you didn't feel protected.
But you felt protected for the 10 plagues and going through the sea.
Well, that was then.
That was just yesterday, right? I forgot yesterday.
Today I'm
Exactly, Barbara.
So
exactly.
Why aren't you giving me this? And
Right.
therefore I'm going to complain to my leader.
Right. Okay. I'm just saying. Yes, Marie. Go ahead.
So if God is Ehad, is one, and He's unity and He's perfection, He's outside of time and space, He's all powerful and all the other attributes, and that's something that's in the heavenly realm, and it's in a level of perfection that individual humans, even as good as Moses is, he doesn't achieve on his own independently. So he's godly but not God. And so individually and as groups and all across, there's a diversity and a pluralistic imperfection in the human person that can only participate in God and understand and have certain attributes, but can't be the unity and the perfection that is God. So there's a separation.
Okay. Right. So yes. So we're limited and we can't be. But what that leads me to, Marie, is that by everyone in the world together, based on however we are created and whatever abilities or disabilities we're created with, it all is a manifestation of God. So all 7 billion of us represent God, and as the world grows, a few years from now, 10 billion, there's still 10 billion depictions of God, each one unique. each one representing the infinite aspect of God. So yes, that's another way to put it in understanding God and defining God. Yes, Sherry.
So we were talking about God on all these positive attributes, but then there's God the Annihilator.
Right. So warrior in the Torah is a positive attribute, but if you're an Egyptian, it's not positive. And also with all the plagues that affected the Egyptians too. Right. So yes, God is vengeful. And God kills Israelites throughout the desert. So yes, there are negative aspects of God. So is God negative in that way? So again, for the Torah, it's clear in the Torah that people are allowed to understand events as if God caused those events to happen. So let me put it this way. So 1948, State of Israel is established. A prayer is added to the prayer book that reflects the establishment of the State of Israel as a miraculous event. So for Purim and for Hanukkah, we have this prayer, Al Hanisim, that's added to the Amidah, the central prayer of all three services of the day. Al Hanisim for the miracles. So miracle of Hanukkah, the jar of oil, defeating the Greeks. Purim, defeating Haman. And Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day, 600,000 Jews defeating the 21 armies of the Arabs that came to defeat them. So it's a historical event. It's written up in all the sources of how Israel managed to do that, what kind of help they got from Czechoslovakia, from America, other sources, the Palmach, the underground that Israel already was working on and training their own army. So there are ways for Israel to do it, and it's all depicted in the sources, but if you're a believer, that was miraculous. And you respond to that in a miraculous way. So just by extension then, if you go further back in history, there are people who would respond to all events like that in that miraculous way. Now, of course, the challenge to that is the Holocaust. So if you're going to view events as caused by God, then that's a challenge when you have tragic events besides positive, miraculous, blessed events. But the point for the Torah is that for the Torah, God is seen in the course of human events. Okay, so that's another way of understanding God and how God understands, how the Torah understands God. God intervenes in and directs human events. Okay, which also means that God causes people to be born the way that they are born, and to have abilities or disabilities as well. So that'll be we'll transition into this topic, this part 2 of this topic next Wednesday evening. Have a good night. Yep. Okay.